So remember, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos, and I always make at least one mistake because I do these off the top of my head. So if that happens, recognize that the whole point of doing these sorts of things is you can check and you can say, God, that doesn't sound right when she said, 7 million horses, I don't know, won the Battle of Gettysburg. Look it up and tell me and tell other people, and people can fix it. And again, once again, I did not go over to my friend's house that has cable because it's really hot here today. So I stayed in my house. And so if the stream's bad, watch it on replay if you're interested. All right, so let me get down to some of the easy questions to handle today, because there are hard questions as well. The first, people want to know how concerned they should be about Russia pulling out of the space station. And I actually find this really interesting because I don't think it has anything to do with the deteriorating relationship between Russia and the US. I think it's a sign about how the war in Ukraine is going for the Russians. That is, keeping astronauts at a space station and keeping a space station in functioning working order is expensive, and it needs a lot of parts. And remember that many countries now have cut off from Russia their access to new parts, new stuff. And all the people who were looking at the invasion of Russia into Ukraine to begin with said, they're going to be okay for a while, despite the sanctions that are coming from all over the world, because they have stuff in warehouses. But that back supply is going to start to fall apart after about 3 months. Well, look where we are. So I suspect, to me, I looked at that and I said, oh, they can't keep that space station functioning any longer. And so they're having to come out with some reason why they have to pull out. And that, because it's not just about a good relationship with another country, it's about indicating that you're at the forefront of some kind of modern technology. So that's what I saw happening, rather as if I just announced here with great thumping on the table that I am going to boycott running in the Boston Marathon. Well, anybody who knows me knows that I could yell that as long as I wanted, but the chances of me, I wish I were a marathoner. That was the one thing in my life I regret that I never was. I was a runner, but never a marathoner. Similarly, I think that them saying, well, we're not going to play anymore is not about a principled stand so much as we can't do it, which is the same way it would be if I said, I'm not going to participate in the Boston Marathon. I can't do it. Not just that I won't do it, I can't do it. So that's how I read that. So it's the kind of thing that I would use in a book if I were writing about Russia right now. I would use it as a symbol of how badly this war is hurting Russia. I could be wrong, but that's how I read it. And I would always urge you, I'm going to tell you more about this in a minute. I would always urge you, when you read the news, to think about what the backstory is, in a way kind of as if your fourth grade child is telling you a story, in which you're listening to your fourth grader and you trust your fourth grader, but you do recognize that your fourth grader's version of events probably has a backstory that you haven't heard. And that's not a bad way to go into any of the news, is recognizing that there's a backstory that you probably haven't heard. And for me, that's the fun of it, is figuring out the backstory. So on that front, let me go to a different question that people had, and that was about the Secret Service and what's going on with the Secret Service. And I said before, Mary Jane, they say they're building their own. Yeah, I'm training for a marathon too. Once again, believe it when you see it. And that's actually another great thing about the news. Again, you will note that I never wrote about Kanye West's running for president in 2016 because he didn't have a committee. He didn't have, he had no organization to do that. Similarly, if you read my letters, I never talked about Elon Musk buying Twitter, because there too, everybody's hair went on fire. It was a deal that was 6 months out, and there were way too many loopholes in it to believe it was really going to happen. And it might still, but there are many things that it's appropriate to worry about when they happen. And so, yeah, they say they're building their own space station. Let's see. I'm not buying the bottle of champagne to knock it over the front yet. Secret Service. So, one of the things that obviously has come out lately is that texts amongst members of the U.S. Secret Service from January 5th and January 6th have disappeared. And there have been a number of stories for why they have disappeared, none of which really hold water, I don't think. And I guess I'm not going to bother to give you all the different um, versions that have been offered for how those things disappeared. But let me just start first of all by saying that once again, any official correspondence, any any correspondence in the White House or around the White House belongs to us. You're not the president and the people around the president are not allowed to have conversations that are not accessible to the public in our archives, with the exception of things that are covered by national security or by executive privilege. And national security, I hope, is self-evident. And executive privilege, I know it makes a lot of people angry, but executive privilege is actually designed to guarantee that presidents can get a full range of options, because you want your advisors to be able to come in out of left field and to say things that they might be embarrassed by later, or any number of things, without being afraid it's going to show up on the cover of a major newspaper. So that idea of executive privilege, certainly presidents have tried to use it in really authoritarian ways, but there is an argument behind it. If it's not one of those two things, though, we are supposed to have it in our archives for people like me and anybody else who wants them, so that we can have a sense of what our government is doing. It can't do things secretly. Sometimes things are protected for a number of years in case there are people still alive or in case there's some kind of national security reason. But generally, everything is supposed to go to the archives. And I've said before, archivists are very possessive of that, and they should be. They're not just being jerks saying, I want that. They are protecting our national memory. And I'm actually writing a book about this now. Our national memory is who we are. Think about human beings. I mean, really what changes us from any other species is the way we understand the passage of time and the way we make stories out of the passage of time. And how we see the passage of time is different than other species. And there's actually really interesting stories about animals and how they perceive time and how they perceive change. Obviously, that's not my field of study, but I'm interested in it. But if you change somebody's past by slicing holes through it or by lying about it, you change the present, you change who they are. And if you don't, I mean, if you feel like I'm way out in left field here, go pick up George Orwell's 1984 again, in which the main character, Winston Smith, his job is to rewrite history and to throw the old history down the memory hole. That's where we get the term memory hole, in which you just write a new history so then you can have a new present. So the archivists who save the details of our history are not just about, hey, I'm a little nerd who lives in the corner. They're about, this is who we are. And we must have a record of who we are, because if we don't have a record of who we are, our present changes, or our present can be changed. All right. So anyway, everything that the government does is supposed to be preserved. And really, this is a big deal, to the point that the presidents can exempt some things. But I remember a story, I think it was about Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, whose mother was in a picture with a world leader. And he had to get approval to take that picture of his mother. He didn't care so much about it being with the world leader, but it belonged to the White House. And he had to get permission to take a picture of his mother out of the White House because it was part of the official record. I'm sure they made copies and all that. But that record really matters. All right. So when, for example, the former president Donald Trump took a number of boxes of things to Mar-a-Lago, 22 boxes of records to Mar-a-Lago, that mattered. That was ours. That's as if somebody came into our memory and said, we're just taking that. And of course, now we know some of that material was top secret, and that's another problem. But the memory itself really matters. All right. So that's why the people are supposed to use official systems, and everything is supposed to be preserved unless it's clearly personal. And there are times when a judge, for example, or somebody in the executive branch will say, yeah, that's clearly personal. And a great example of that is that you all know about the tapes from Nixon's Oval Office from the White House. But what lots of people don't know is that Nixon also kept a personal tape recorder. I think it was on his belt. It was a personal tape recorder in which he recorded his personal thoughts. And a judge listened to those. There were Freedom of Information Act requests for those. And a judge listened to those and said, no, this is personal. This is not anything to do with the nation. This is about his own. He sort of said it was an internal monologue fit for a therapist and really not for anyone else. So there are times when those things are exempted. Anyway, the Secret Service's records missing from January 5th and January 6th are a huge deal for a couple of reasons. First, because they were supposed to preserve them. Second, because they were told to preserve them by people looking into the insurrection of January 6th. And days after they were told to preserve them, they deleted them or they purged them, allegedly with the upgrades into new phones. But anybody who does that kind of an upgrade knows that you're supposed to preserve what's on those phones first. You don't simply erase it. I mean, that's even when you take in your phone, when I take in my phone, they preserve everything that's on it. I mean, I don't have to save it because I'm not part of the government, but the idea that you would simply have it erased, I've just never even heard of such a thing. So why is that important? It suggests that, and they're I'm not a lawyer, but they are almost certainly breaking a law having done that, to do that. So why is that important? It suggests that was something in those texts that made them more willing to openly break a law, be openly defiant about something, than to admit what was in those texts. So whatever's in them seems like it was worse than the other law they were breaking. At least that's what it looks like on the surface. And we don't know what that is. And that's one thing to be really careful about when you think about history, is that you often make inferences thinking, oh, it must have been about January 5th and January 6th. That's my guess too. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was about, I'm totally making this up, but maybe it was about a major drug deal. I mean, we don't know what was in that. And it's always a mistake to think we do. We can make some pretty good guesses, but we don't know. We don't know. We don't know. And that's always important, is to recognize what you do know and what you don't know. All right. So why is this important? It's important now because we know that Mike Pence, who was vice president under Donald Trump, refused to get in a car driven by a Secret Service agent. And we also know that Mike Pence was aware of the attempt to get him out of the picture, or to get him to not count in the electoral votes favoring electing Joe Biden. So he clearly was suspicious about something. Now, we don't know how suspicious, because he has not talked in public. And although his chief of staff and his legal counsel have both testified to the January 6th House Committee, the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, which is a House committee, not a Senate committee, it's a House committee. And we know they have testified before the Department of Justice, which is the criminal investigation of what happened. So for all we know, they've said something, but we don't have access to what that might have been. So we know that something might have been afoot with the Secret Service, but we actually know more than that as well. All of this kind of came together all at once. So you may remember, I've lost track of days, but beginning of the month, maybe, I don't know. You can search this webpage for the guy's name. I think it's James Murray. You could, here, I did it right here. I think it's James Murray. Now I can't find it. He was the director of the Secret Service under Trump. Trump appointed him, and he was known at the time as a loyalist. And he resigned quite abruptly at the beginning of this month and took a job at Snap, which is the parent company of Snapchat. He's a fairly young man. He's in his early 50s, as near as I can tell. And that seemed like a huge step down. So people who were watching the things happening in the federal government, and of course I'm one of those, looked at that and went, something's up. something's about to drop. And that's when we heard about the missing texts from the Secret Service. So it certainly looks as if he knew something big was coming, and he tried to get out. Now he hasn't actually left office. He doesn't leave office until I think the end of this month. So he is still part of the government, and that holds some responsibilities as well. But we're not done yet. The other thing that we have learned since all this began, although it was out there, I mean, these weren't secrets, but so much of what's going on now is putting pieces together, is that the assistant, the assistant director of, the deputy assistant director of the Secret Service was a man named, during January 6th, was a man named Anthony Ornato. Anthony, not Anthony, that's Anthony Blinken. Anthony Ornato. And he is still in the Secret Service, but he was the head of the security detail for Trump. And then Donald Trump named him the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. Gave him a political role in the White House. Now, that's not supposed to happen. The Secret Service are supposed to be a security detail. But Trump brought him into the political realm, and he was very well known as being a staunch Trump loyalist. Now, the reason you've heard his name is because when Cassidy Hutchinson said that she had walked into a room and saw Ornato saying Trump just jumped his agent, there were two Secret Service officers who said that was not true. And he was one of them, and he's a loyalist. Now, you will note that Cassidy Hutchinson testified under oath, and those two officers who contradicted her won't go anywhere near testifying under oath. But that's why his name was in the news. So what we are looking as if we are seeing is a Secret Service that had been compromised politically by the former president in such a way that Vice President Pence didn't trust them. Now, a larger picture issue here, I think, is the Secret Service itself. And this is, you probably know this, a bit of a hobby horse for me. The Secret Service was always housed in the Treasury Department. And it was housed, and it sounds totally weird, I know, but it was housed in the Treasury Department because it began during the Civil War, when the United States government invented national money for the first time. And because engravers were just guys off the street, very talented guys off the street, but they didn't have the kind of security systems we have now in our money, so that a good engraver who wasn't working for the government could pretty much copy the bills. And so at the same time during the Civil War that there was a huge, these huge releases of both greenbacks and national banknotes, which are two separate kinds of paper money during the Civil War, there were also counterfeiters. And the counterfeiters were just flooding the market with fake bills. And so the Treasury Department comes up with its own law enforcement arm to try and crack down on the counterfeiters. And after the war, I mean, they're still cracking down on counterfeiters, but that's, and they're sort of still there being government policey kind of guys, and please never quote me on that one. But when Grover Cleveland in 1894 needs a security detail because people are threatening to kill him, the government's kind of like, well, what are we going to do? We don't want the president to have his own goons, so what are we going to do? And they turn to the Secret Service. So the Secret Service begins to protect the president, even though it's still housed in the Treasury Department. And then it gets its own, goes on and gets its own history as people who protect the president. That changes in 2003 after the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security picks up the Secret Service and it moves it out of the Treasury and into the Department of Homeland Security. Once that happens, it is my sense that the Secret Service loses its professionalism for a very simple reason. And that is that, and again, this is my hobby horse. You don't have to agree with this. You certainly should give it some thought, though, because I am very concerned about the Department of Homeland Security, because all of our other departments in the country, in the government, have quite long histories, and they have they have their own traditions. And those traditions and those series of regulations and the series of rules mean that they are, although they do serve the president, they have their own internal consistency. That is, they are inclined to try and preserve their own traditions as well as trying to serve the president. the Department of Homeland Security has always answered to the president since 2003. It's a very recent department. And that, I think, makes it particularly susceptible to a president who is willing to use it for his own ends. And so after the move of the Secret Service over there to the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, they have seemed a lot less professional, and that's not just having to do with Trump. I mean, if you do a Google search, for example, the Secret Service has been in a lot of messes lately, and I think that probably because they've been contaminated by politics. So that's what you asked about that. The Electoral College. You wanted to know about the Electoral College, which I feel like I talk about a lot, and somebody here wants the Jonathan Swan article. Okay, I'll put that on here. That's actually a good segue. So the Jonathan Swan article in, where was it? It was in Axios. And by the way, Axios has been doing great work lately. They really have been. Vox too. Ian Millhiser and Vox is just spectacular, and so is Zach Beauchamp. I read both of those guys. Everything they write, I read. Will Bunch, Philadelphia Inquirer. All right, I'll stop with that. But Jonathan Swan was talking about the Schedule F system, and I wrote a whole letter about this, the Schedule F system that Trump tried to invent in October 21st, actually, of 2020. And what that would do is it would end our national system of civil service, of professional civil service, and replace the entire governmental system with people who are loyal to the president. And the way that he would do that is by overturning the system that's been in place since the Pendleton Act of 1883, which gave us our professional civil service. And they found a lawyer in the federal government under Trump found a loophole that said that people who were not protected under the civil service protections of the Pendleton Act, and I'll tell you more about that in a second, could be removed from office if they engaged in policy decisions and some other things as well. And so what they did is they figured they could go through their agencies and reclassify people under this new filing called Schedule F, which would make them fireable by a new president. But then they would also guarantee that once you were in place, it was very hard to fire you. So the whole plan here would be to get rid of the qualifications for anybody working in the civil service. Currently now you have to take examinations and you have to be qualified for your job, and it would take away your job protections. And that way Trump could replace them all with loyalists. And when I say loyalists, I don't just mean Republicans. They were very clear when they tried to put this in place that they would get rid of what they called rhinos, Republicans in name only, and only fill positions with true Trump believers. And we've seen what that would look like. So this is one of the things about the resurgence of Trump or anyone like him that is really terrifying, because first of all, our civil servants are terrific. And I just want to lay that out there. The whole idea since Reagan that people who work for the government are somehow lazy and just collecting a paycheck infuriates me, because increasingly they've had to do more with less. And they are us. They are what keep our government going. They're what keep our passports coming, or explain our paychecks, or any number of the many, many things they do. So they're vital to the operation of a government that works for us. But for me, more than that, no offense if you're listening and a civil servant, for me, what they do is they provide the backbone that stabilizes a country. That is, if you have a whole group of officials, bureaucrats, if you will, and I don't even care if they're doing a job, really, although, as I say, our civil servants do more than they ought to. They are loyal not to a person, but to the system. And they provide the ballast, if you will, for a ship. That is, a president can change about 4,000 of the political appointees in the country. And so they could shift from somebody on the far left to somebody on the far right. But they're not going to be able to shift that major group of people who are like, I care that, that the roads get paved. I care that bridges don't fall down. I don't care who's in charge of signing things at the end of the day. I want the roads paved. We need those people really badly. And if you look at societies, I spent a long time doing this the other day. If you look at stable societies, invariably, they have a serious group of nonpartisan bureaucrats who are loyal to the system and to the state rather than to an individual. And this is why, of course, they drove Donald Trump bonkers, because he would try and make them do things that were loyal to him, and they'd push back. And then he would promptly say, oh, they're radical leftists. But they weren't. A lot of those people who were pushing back against Trump were actually Republicans, sometimes fervent Republicans, but they believed in the system. So Rod Rosenstein, for example, a Republican who appointed Robert Mueller, a Republican. Those are people who cared about the system. And, they might not have liked Democrats, but they also didn't like that Trump was trying to destroy our government. So that's what Jonathan Swann's article was about, but he was emphasizing the fact that they are still planning to do this going forward. There is in place in the Trump camp a system of people, of loyalists, people like Jim Jordan and Devin Nunes and Mark Meadows and lots of the lawyers who tried to overturn the election, who are trying to put together a new program for what a second Trump term would look like. And part of putting that in place means guaranteeing that there isn't a nonpartisan civil service, that in fact only loyalists are in place so they can do things that a nonpartisan civil service would stop them from doing. And people should be terrified by that, because that essentially would turn the apparatus of our government into an authoritarian system just like that. And there's a distinction, by the way, between an authoritarian system and a totalitarian system. And meaning that an authoritarian system basically just says, you all are going to do what I say. A totalitarian system says, and you're going to think the way I tell you to think. And I actually am concerned that an authoritarian system under Trump could go all the way toward a totalitarian system. And you see this now. I would never, if you'd asked me that even 4 years ago, I'd said, oh, come on, authoritarian maybe, but not totalitarian. The attempt to destroy our educational system and to control what kind of books people can see that's the hallmark of a totalitarian government, that we're going to give you the only thoughts you can have in your head. And for that, again, go back to 1984, to Orwell's 1984. All right, so I'm going to skip a little bit from where I wanted to go here, because I just saw somebody put up a picture of John Roberts there, and I think this follows pretty nicely in that this is not popular. The idea of destroying our government is not popular around the country. And there are far more people who think this is a terrible idea than who think it's a ducky idea. How do I know that? I know that from polls, of course, but polls are generally, there's a difference between polls of everyone and polls of voters. And that really matters, because, which at the end of the day, who's going to show up and vote? What I tend to look for is what people who are responsible to a political party are doing. And that article that came out in CNN, it wasn't an article, I'm sorry, it was a TV report on CNN about John Roberts this morning was fascinating to me, because it argued that John Roberts had tried terribly hard to stop the Supreme Court from overturning Roe versus Wade. And it pointed to the release of that early decision, Alito's early decision, as an attempt to force those who were wavering to stay on board the extremist train to overturn Roe versus Wade. Because that, of course, wasn't even what the original case was about. And there's 2 points about that are interesting. The first is that when that draft was leaked, of course, everybody, especially in right-wing media, started screaming about how, this is a leak from the left and all kinds of stuff. And people even at the time said, well, no, what this does is it locks in the right-wing votes, because nobody is now going to want to say, oh, oopsie poopsie, I've changed my mind. Roberts, the report on Roberts this morning confirmed that in fact he was trying to sway some of the newer members of the court, not to go as far as they did with overturning Roe versus Wade. And once the leak happened, he was locked in. So that would suggest they were locked in. So that would suggest that the leak came from somebody on the right. The reporter suggested that there's just been confusion, and that's why we don't know who actually did the leak. I would suggest that they're not looking terribly hard because they have recognized that it came from somebody on the right. And I have my suspicions. They are only suspicions, but remember that court has leaked a lot lately, and it is leaked from a certain wing of the court. I might say more about that in just a minute. So Roberts went on to, the report about Roberts went on to say that he had tried terribly hard to pull people back and not to overturn Roe and on and on and on. Okay, fine. Once again, let's go back to the Russian space station. If that were the case, and a Supreme Court Chief Justice were really concerned about that vote, he had options. He didn't then have to do what he did, which was to support that majority, right? That vote was 6-3 at the end of the day. Now it was split over one of the issues, but there are many things that Chief Justice could have done if he had disagreed, and he chose not to do them. There are many things he could do now that so far he has chosen not to do. He could speak up about it. That's generally not done. He could resign so that Biden could put somebody else in his place. He could do any number of things to try and rebalance the Supreme Court, and he's not doing them. So what I read, and in fact, when the opinion was leaked, he could have come out and said, this leaked because we're trying to make this a more reasonable decision. He didn't do that either. So what I read that story today as being was him trying to get out there and say, it wasn't me, I'm one of the good guys. Because he recognizes just how badly people loathe this Dobbs versus Jackson women's health decision. And we are seeing exactly what people who were opposed to the overturning of Roe said was going to happen. We're seeing people who are coming close to dying from the fact doctors won't treat their miscarriages. We're seeing this 10-year-old child from Ohio who had to travel to Indiana to get an abortion. Now, Indiana is the first state to hold a special session. They're holding it right now to decide what they are going to do about abortion in the aftermath of Roe versus Wade. And I would urge you to watch that because they too recognize that people don't like how far that this decision has gone. But so what that said to me today about Roberts is that he recognizes just how much the current day Republican agenda is out of step with Americans who are going to vote. And that's a really big red flag that that story came out. Again, not there are many ways in which that story was a surprise, not least that the Supreme Court generally tries not to leak, and now it's a sieve. I mean, I sort of feel like everybody is leaking from that. So so I'm seeing now people asking about abortion as a private matter, and this isn't the direction I meant to go. I hope I still have time to go the direction I meant to go. So people asked about originalism and what is going on with originalism, and that deals with both abortion and gun rights. And the idea behind originalism, I've written a lot about this. The idea behind originalism is to try and get us back to before the 1950s, when the Supreme Court began to use the 14th Amendment to the Constitution to protect civil rights and to regulate business. So what that 14th Amendment did is it said that no state could deprive a citizen of due process of law or equal protection of the laws. And one of the things about Roe versus Wade is that it was actually argued under a slightly different principle, and many people thought it should be under the Equal Protection Clause exclusively or directly. And that Equal Protection Clause is really what's given us all of our civil rights protections. And those Americans who would like to get away both from business regulation and from civil rights protections want to go back to an original reading of the Constitution. But what's interesting about that is that their original reading is completely cherry-picked. So, for example, You recently saw them say there's nothing in the Constitution about abortion and that abortion was illegal in that period. It was not. I mean, historians will talk themselves blue saying, of course it was not. We have the case that somebody just suggested here that of one of the framers of the Constitution himself, was very aware of a second trimester abortion, and in which he said this is a private matter. This is something that the state is not going to get involved with. This is between basically the women who are going to be handling this, because abortion was extremely common right into the 19th century, and it was discussed in a number of ways, but there were, as people have pointed out, even Benjamin Franklin produced a recipe for abortions, and the way they talked about it was that it was unhealthy for a woman not to have her period, and so you had to restore that period and stop. They are literally called blockages, and that's advertising is going to show up in the 19th century newspapers until the 1870s, and it's really common knowledge that that's the case. So abortions are not regulated, and they're simply not the sort of thing that the Constitution would have gotten into, which is the Constitution does two things. It sets up a system of government, the Congress and the executive branch and the judiciary. And the judiciary is very vague about what's going on with the judiciary. I might have more time to talk about that in a minute. And then in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, what the Constitution does is it says what the state cannot do. Okay, that's really important. It doesn't say, hey, you're an American citizen, you get to have an abortion. It says the state cannot do these things. It's about the state and what the state can do. The state cannot tell you what religion to belong to. The state cannot tell you what you can publish in a book. The state cannot do certain things. It cannot stop a well-regulated militia. It cannot stop a state from developing its own militia. It cannot do certain things. It doesn't say that individuals have individual rights. That's just not what they're concerned about. That's not what they're doing. They don't really have concepts of individual rights at that point. And that brings us to so the state cannot stop a woman from, I mean, they're not thinking about what's happening in private households at all at that point. The state is not involved in that. Similarly, when the state talks about a well-regulated militia, the state is not conferring an individual right to own a gun. That's not even discussed until Justice Scalia, Antonin Scalia, makes that argument in the Heller case in Washington, D.C., and I think 2008. And even he says that is subject to regulations. But the whole point of this is that originalists try and sort of invent a past that they like, rather than actually, how do we know what on earth the framers thought about interstate commerce? We have to guess. What do we think they thought about climate change? They had no imagination to think about that, and they certainly didn't have imagination to think about an AR-15. One AR-15 in the American Revolution, and the war's over, right? So we can't really do that. It's a cover for a modern day argument that that the real centerpiece of power should be in the American states, and that in turn is going to mean that the federal government can't regulate business, can't support a national social safety net, and can't, protect equal rights, can't protect civil rights. I was going to say something else about originalism. I can't remember what the other piece of that was. You asked about abortion. You asked about, I don't know. I've forgotten the other thing I was going to tell you about originalism. So no, there's one other piece of it. So to my mind, to me, that's not smart. I mean, I get frustrated when I always read about how Antonin Scalia was just so freaking brilliant, because I've read his stuff, and I don't get. Maybe I'm just too dumb to get it, but I don't think you can invent this whole idea of recreating this concept. I mean, he argues that you need to reconceive the concept of the centerpiece of democracy being in the American states, which is what today's Supreme Court, which is dominated by originalists, says. But I think it is intellectually inconsistent to argue that at the same time you also don't say, therefore, the states must protect the right to vote. I don't get it. To me, if somebody can explain that to me intellectually, I'm all ears, because I can't. That was my project last summer, and I never figured out an argument for that. I don't see how you can say that the states should be able to control everything and then not also say that the states must protect everyone's right to vote, because otherwise what happens in the states is exactly what we're looking at now, and what we looked at in America before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and what we looked at in America before 1870. What you're looking at is a bunch of, a group of powerful people in a state making sure that nobody but them can vote, and then saying, yeah, this is democracy. That's not democracy. That's, a form of authoritarianism. So I don't see anything intellectually consistent there, and it really bothers me. Now, much more interesting to me is Stephen Breyer, who has just stepped down from the court and been replaced by Ketanji Brown Jackson. And what he said was, listen, lots of competing interests. The whole point of the Supreme Court is you get difficult cases, and each side has a really good point. So what do you do? How do you decide? Like somebody like the modern day right wing on the court says, well, you should do whatever the framers said. And the Warren Court, for example, that protects civil rights, would have said, well, you should do whatever protects individuals. And Breyer said, well, maybe we should actually do both in this. We should honor the framers. We should honor what the framers wanted. So he takes from originalism. And we should honor the modern era. That's what he takes from those using the 14th Amendment to protect civil rights. And we should look at cases and we should say, we are going to declare it the law of the land by deciding whichever side promotes democracy. I love that idea. That idea strikes me as being really smart. That's both what the framers wanted, democracy, and don't give me the whole democracy versus republic thing. They are both representative forms of government. And no, they did not talk about democracy in that era, but they're forms of government, and we currently do not have a democracy. We have a republic, that's true, but the whole we're not a democracy, we're a republic thing was an attempt of the John Birchers to explain why they didn't think black people could vote. So whenever you hear that, that's what people are talking about. So honor the framers' commitment to democracy without giving short shrift to the modern day equal protection of the laws. To me, it's a no-brainer, except it's very elegant. I mean, it's a really elegant argument in a way that I don't think originalism is. All right, so let me go forward into where I was expecting to go here. And that is, you wanted to hear about the Electoral College. And this is not, there's actually a segue from originalism to the Electoral College, because we're in a lot of trouble right now with the Electoral College. And let me explain what the Electoral College is and what it's all about. So the Electoral College made sense, again, for the framers. That is, in a period when we didn't have modern media and we didn't have good transportation, they had no reason to expect that somebody living on a farm in New Hampshire would have any freaking clue who was the smartest guy in South Carolina, because there just wasn't that much traffic back and forth. You were ending up, basically, you weren't going to travel far unless you were on the coastline and you had access to a boat. You weren't going to go far from your town, and whatever news you got was going to be weeks after it happened, and you wouldn't know who the important people were in this newfangled big country. So the framers set up a system that was designed so that rather than voting for the grand poobah, you'd vote for guys in your local community who were, they traveled, they had money, they read stuff. They would be able to make good decisions about who should run the country. And the belief was that if you elected these electors, which we still do, by the way, we don't vote for president, we vote for electors. If you voted for these electors, they'd all get together, they'd go to the Electoral College, and they would talk about who were the best dudes. They were all going to be dudes. Who were the best dudes? And their hope, of course, was that they would say, oh, it's George Washington, or oh, it's, John Smith, or whomever. But they also thought that that was unlikely, and that more likely is they would kick up 2 or 3 people, and it would go to the House of Representatives, where everybody would have one vote. Every state would have one vote. Not everybody. Every state would have one vote, and they'd pick somebody. So it was kind of designed to be this winnowing, we'll get there sort of thing. By the time people came out of the Electoral College, they would, nobody would put up with somebody who was a real weenie. You'd get some pretty good people tossed up there. And then, then by the time it got to the House, people would pick somebody. This changes dramatically in 1800, in the election of 1800, because in the election of 1796, Thomas Jefferson, who was from Virginia, and Virginia, they don't have a way to count people when they write the census. When they write the Constitution. So in the early years of the Constitution, Virginia's got like a gazillion electoral votes compared to everybody else. And they're going to lose a lot of those when they finally take a census after 1800. That's why we have a census every 10 years on our Constitution. They didn't know. And Virginia was like, well, we don't know, but we just think we have this many. And they have way too many. So Thomas Jefferson figures out in 1796 that if the entire body of the electors of Virginia had backed him in 1796, he would have been elected. Because they didn't, he doesn't get elected. And he convinces the electors from the state of Virginia to do a winner-take-all system, so that in 1800, when they all vote, he's going to clean up because he's going to get all the votes from Virginia. Once he does that, James Madison goes bonkers, and he's like, this is nuts, because we're going to end up with a system where you can win the Electoral College without being popular. Not talking about the popular vote yet, but without being popular. And he wants to amend the Constitution to stop that. Of course, any president who has, and any party that has won power with that system is like, no, we're not going to change it, right? So quickly, before about 1820, all the other states are going to follow suit, because you can't continue to split your vote, continue to be a representational system when Virginia is doing what it's doing, because then your guys are never going to get in. So the first problem with the Electoral College was the bastardization of it in 1800. The second was that in 1929, after the census of 1920, when Congress recognized that more people lived in the cities than lived in the country, and if you continued to add to the House of Representatives, the cities were going to win out, they capped the number of people in the House of Representatives. When they capped that people, what it did is it first of all made the average House district way bigger. But second, that business of it getting way bigger really discriminates against the really big states, because again, if everybody has a representative at 30,000 people, and California has, California gets one every 30,000, it's going to have a ton of people, and the smaller states just aren't going to have that many comparatively. If you move it up to be about where it is now, which is 75,000 people, the smaller states don't take nearly the hit that the bigger states do. So that's the other problem, is that the Electoral College, which is all the senators and representatives for each state, are skewed toward the smaller states because of this. Okay, so how do we deal with this? Personally, I would love to see the popular vote. We don't need this system any longer. It is unwieldy, and it's giving us all these problems. Politically, that's very hard to do, because somebody's always going to be screaming, what about the Electoral College? We love the Electoral College. And so one of the things I think about is simply saying, yes, I love the Electoral College too. I want it to be representational, the way it was intended to be, and I want it to have the number of people that it ought to have because of what happened after 1929. So that's why we're in the mess we're in. with the, and Don says it's more like 900,000 people per representative. I thought it was 750. I knew it was climbing, and clearly I'm wrong about that. All right, so uh, I wanted to give you two more. I'm a little bit slower than I thought because I took that rabbit hole, but I wanted to talk to you about where we are right now, because I think this is really interesting, and I'll try and wrap it all up really quickly. So a lot of people have been wondering about the Republican Party and what's happening with the Republican Party, which certainly looks in many ways as if it has a grip on everything. I would urge you again to remember that I'm very concerned. Many people are very concerned about the 19 states, for example, which have changed their laws in such a way that makes it harder for Democrats to vote, or it gives um, party officers the ability to choose electors, or any of the many ways in which Republicans are trying to stack the deck. I would urge you to remember that the only reason that they are doing that is because they know they cannot win the popular vote. They know they are unpopular. If you're popular, you don't care what other people think, because you know you're going to win anyway. You don't care if there's somebody out there howling in the wilderness, because you actually are strengthened by letting them continue. The fact that the radical right is trying to shut up so many of us indicates that they know they are in trouble. So what does this moment look like compared to our past? I am fascinated by the fact that in 1879, the former Confederates, and most people don't know this story, but the former Confederates took over the US Congress, and they tried to shut down the government and put their own person in and make it impossible for the Republicans at the time to run the country. They wanted to get rid of the entire Republican program and put in place the program that had been embraced by the Confederacy. What happened? What happened was that people organized and they pushed back. And that did two things. First of all, it meant that the next president that was elected, James Garfield, was the most vocal supporter of Black rights and equality since Lincoln. He's going to be assassinated, so most people don't remember that. And he's not assassinated because of his views. He's assassinated by a disappointed office seeker. But in addition to that, what happens is that the Democratic Party, and remember the party switched sides in the 1960s, the Democratic Party rebuilds. And it rebuilds along the lines that took off in the 20th century. That is, they throw overboard their crazy radical former Confederates, and they turn to Grover Cleveland. They turn to a reformer who's enormously popular, who wants equal rights for white Americans and Black Americans, and who represents the new urban democracy that is eventually going to become FDR. So in this moment where you're seeing so much not confusion, the Republican Party is clearly splitting. There are people in the what I would call the establishment wing, but mind you, they're still far to the right, who are turning against the Trump people. But you are also seeing in Missouri, for example, a man running for the Senate as an independent saying, he was actually one of the lawyers for the January 6th committee, and saying, I'm a true conservative, and I don't want any part of these wackos. I want to rebuild a real Republican Party. And you're starting to see people breaking off, Evan McMullin in Utah, and the attempts of people like Larry Hogan in Maryland and in other places to say, I don't want any part of those crazies. And the recognition in places like John Roberts's statement today, or like what's happening in the Indiana legislature right now, where they're backing off from their extremism on abortion, this sense that the party really maybe recognizes that it's got to do something to bring itself into the modern world. And of course, from Grover Cleveland, you can hear the eyes rolling now. And anybody who studies Grover Cleveland is actually a real fan of Grover Cleveland, but it's important to remember that all the people who couldn't stomach Grover Cleveland because he was a Democrat and they were all Republicans essentially adopted his entire program wholeheartedly when Theodore Roosevelt put it forward. So when I say Grover Cleveland, you should hear Theodore Roosevelt, because there was this skip through the democracy, through the Democrats into the Republicans at that moment. All right, so is the Republican Party splitting? Yes. What's going to happen? I don't know. Lots of us are still very concerned that that the really, let's call them fascists at this point, have sewn up the mechanics of our government in such a way that it's going to be impossible to push back. But at the same time, there certainly have been occasions when it looked, for example, like the Democrats in 1879 were going to take down the U.S. government. And you don't even know that story because they died so fully and completely. Similarly, the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. The Nazi Party in America actually had, in 1939, a rally at Grand Central Station. I'm sorry, what's the one in New York? The big thing in New York, Madison Square Garden. 20,000 people showed up to a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in 1939. And, the Nazis looked like they were going to make huge inroads in America, and they didn't. Why didn't they, seems to me to be the central question. And why didn't the Confederates take over in 1879? And why didn't the Confederates take over the government in 1860 when instead Americans turned to Abraham Lincoln? And this is where, once again, you come in, because the majority recognized they were the majority and they worked together. And that doesn't mean they all worked in one party. It means that they all called attention to the ways in which an authoritarian government didn't serve them, didn't serve their neighbors. And that nailing together of different groups to say, listen, we may not agree on financial matters, we may not agree on social matters, we may not agree in any number of the different things that are on the table right now, but we are 100% agreed that unless we have a say in that, this country is going down. And that common sense, we as Americans stand against authoritarianism, was really evident in the 1850s, brought together by people like Abraham Lincoln. It was really evident in 1879, brought together by people like James Garfield, and in the present, brought together by people like you. And you look at all the different organizations that became as just somebody turning to their neighbor, as I assume Mothers Against Greg Abbott in Texas did, or the Mormon women whose name I'm going to forget now, but the Mormon women who've been anti-Trump now since during the Trump administration, or Red, Wine, and Blue, or the Lincoln Project, or any of the many places where people are coming together to oppose authoritarianism. Now, I just threw in the Lincoln Project there because a lot of people don't like the Lincoln Project because of the people involved in it. A lot of them are Trumpers. In this moment, doesn't matter. At least it doesn't matter to me. In this moment, what we need to do is break authoritarianism. And then we don't have to be on the same team any longer. But that concept of pushing back against the authoritarianism represented by today's current Republican Party is incredibly important. It's also very exciting because one of the things that I keep pointing to is the idea that because of the recalcitrance of the Republican Party to move forward since 1981, really, we have a lot of ground to make up in this country. And while that's really sort of horrifying to people like me who are not probably going to live to see it, it's exciting to think of what, with enthusiasm and new ideas and a new approach, not only to our environment, which is imperative because of climate change, but also I think to the economy. I think one of the huge problems we have done is we thought that capitalism and democracy went together, and now places like China have made it very clear you can have capitalism without having democracy. I think that's going to involve a lot of rethinking of a lot of things. That's really exciting. And I guess if I have one regret, it's that that I don't get to spend my whole life thinking through those new problems. But what I really intend for me and people like me to do is to pass that on to our children so they get to, and to pass it on to them intact. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm at almost at 60 minutes, but I had one last thing for those of you. You are all curious about what young adult novel I was reading. I haven't finished it, so I can't tell you if it's good yet. But I will tell you, I read young adult novels all the time because they can't use sex and violence to sell, and so what they use is character and plot. And the writing is just spectacular. So if you're looking for new suggestions, one of my favorite books of all time is The Blue Sword by Robin McKinley. It was not the one that won the Newbery for her, but I like it better than the one that did, although much of Robin McKinley is absolutely fabulous. Anything by Polly Horvath, especially the Canning season. And if you haven't read the Canning season, you should run out this minute and buy it, and read it. And I think right now that's all I got for you. Oh no, The Thief by oh crap, Whalen, Megan Turner Whalen, or Megan Whalen Turner, I guess, one or the other. Those are all things that ring on the barrel head. So if you are looking for good young adult novels to read at this very moment, The Blue Sword by Robin McKinley, The Thief by Megan Turner Whalen or Megan Whalen Turner, and Polly Horvath's The Canning Season, or anything by Polly Horvath, is gets my big thumbs up. And just FYI, I don't know any of those women. I don't get a cut in anything. I just am a huge fan of those books. And if you have other suggestions for me, I'd love them, because that's when I'm working on a new book of my own, and that means I have very little brain space for anything. So that's when I really try and dig into the young adult novels. So Sharon Creech. Yep, Sharon Creech is another good one. Yeah. All right. So mine, actually, someone said they read books, young adult books about Nazism. I will tell you, my young adult books tend to have happy endings, because my life in what I do, history, doesn't have happy endings. So I tend to read children's books that have happy endings. So, Eva Ibbotson, Journey to the River Sea. That's another, I should have said that. Eva Ibbetson's Journey to the River Sea is brilliant too. All right, I'll stop, and I will see you soon. Thank you for being here.